Welcome to the first of a new series of screencasts for Component 1, focusing on the topic of the media. And both the screencasts and the lessons will be based around these six themes. So in our introductory screencasts, we're going to look at the changing role of the mass media within society and also consider the media as a source of ideological power. We're then going to move on to look at issues to do with ownership and control of the media. We're then going to focus specifically on the news media. We're then going to look at how the media represents certain social groups. So we'll be looking at stereotypes and media representations connected to things like class, gender, race and ethnicity. We'll then look at the relationship between the media and its audience, looking at the extent to which people are affected by the media products that they consume. And in the final section of the course, we'll consider recent issues in the sociology of the media, including globalization and also a perspective called postmodernism. And this whole topic is assessed in the third and final section of the Component 1 exam. So the first two screencasts are going to introduce you to this new topic area. And in this particular screencast, we're going to consider the first two questions that you can see here. So we define what we mean by the mass media, and then we consider the kind of impact the mass media has by looking at the media as a source of ideological power. And in the second introductory screencast, we'll look at how the role of the mass media has changed in recent years by looking at the concept of new media and Web 2.0. So let's start by defining what sociologists mean by this term, the mass media. And we can see our definition here. We're talking about forms of mass communication. So those means of communication which reach large numbers of people at the same time. And this means that the mass media includes things like television, radio, newspapers and other print media, and of course increasingly important various forms of electronic and digital media. Also, another term to make a note of is this one, media text. Okay, when we use the term media text, we're not just talking about things that are written down. We're talking about any particular type of media product. So that could be a film, a television program, a web page, a newspaper article. We can use the term media text to describe any particular media product. So having briefly defined what we mean by the mass media, let's move on and have a look at this second question, which is about the impact that the mass media has on our ideas and our actions. And we're going to link this question to the concept of ideological power. So many commentators would argue that the media is one of the most important forms of secondary socialization and therefore has a big impact on our norms, our values and our beliefs. But sociologists are divided about exactly how powerful they think the mass media is as an agency of socialization. And there are basically two extreme positions that we can take within sociology when considering the impact of the mass media on our ideas, our values and our behaviour. So position number one is the idea that the audience is relatively weak and the media is very strong and powerful. So if you adopt this position, your argument is the media has a very strong controlling influence over the audience. So from this perspective, media messages work like a drug, and they're seen as having often a very direct and powerful effect on the audience's attitudes and behaviour. And as we shall see in a moment, one particular theory that adopts this position generally is the Marxist perspective. At the other extreme, position number two inverts position number one. So rather than seeing the media as strong, position number two argues that the audience is strong and that the media is relatively weak. So according to this position, the general public are consumers, we are free to choose, and the media have to supply us with what we want or we will go elsewhere. So from this perspective, we are not gullible. We only believe what we want to believe, and our attitudes often come from other sources of socialization apart from the media. And a particular theory that we'll explore in more detail in a few weeks' time that adopts this position is a perspective known as pluralism. So as I mentioned a moment ago, a theory that would adopt position number one is the Marxist perspective. And this simple diagram reflects the relationship between the media and the audience according to Marxism. So for Marxists, the media is perhaps the most powerful agent of social control in modern times. Ralph Miliband, for example, has called the media the new opium of the masses. And Marxists argue that the ruling class, the richest 1 or 2% of the population who own most of the corporate wealth, use the media to control what people think. And their view of the audience is basically a passive mass who are brainwashed by the ideas and values that are transmitted to them by the media. And the key idea here to try and get your head round is this idea of ideological power, sometimes also called hegemony. So according to Marxists, ideological power is the ability to shape people's minds in terms that favour the interests of the power holders within society, the group that Marxists call the ruling class or the bourgeoisie. For example, the Marxist theorist Theodore Adorno argued that the mass media creates a very bland and banal popular culture consisting of things like consumerism, soap operas, sports, fashion, pop music, etc. And that this keeps people occupied, placid and docile, and prevents people from thinking about their own exploitation by the ruling class. So Marxists have a very negative view of the role of the mass media within a capitalist society. They argue that the role of the mass media is there to discourage critical thinking and to make sure that the mass of the population are pacified by pleasant, shallow, banal entertainment. And they argue that people either end up not really knowing what's happening in the world, or they end up with a very false and distorted view of society, what Marxists call a state of false consciousness. For example, Marxists would argue that as a result of ruling class ideology being transmitted by the mass media, most people think that capitalist societies are more equal and meritocratic than they really are, and that this helps to maintain the status quo where wealth remains highly concentrated in the 1 or 2% of the population that constitute the ruling class that control the media. And we'll explore this myth of meritocracy and other examples of ideological power in more detail in class. So for Marxists, the media is the main agent of social control in society, and it helps the ruling class to exploit the working class by controlling what people think. That's this notion of ideological power. However, most sociologists are critical of this Marxist view, as they think that it wrongly assumes that media audiences are passive and gullible. For example, as we can see in this particular cartoon, audiences are often critical and discerning in their use of the media. So from this perspective that rejects Marxism, we should see audiences as active interpreters of media content, able to give it very different meanings and interpretations. And what this cartoon seems to imply is that we filter what we read, what we see, what we hear in the media according to our pre-existing views and interests. And of course the message of the cartoon is much closer to position number 2, this idea that actually the audience are strong and the media's influence is relatively weak. And as I said, later on in the course we'll link this position to a perspective called pluralism. So in this introductory screencast we've considered what we mean by the mass media. We talked about the impact that the mass media might have on us by looking at the concept of ideological power. What we're going to do in the second introductory screencast is consider some of the main ways in which the role of the mass media has changed in recent years.